One of the greatest mysteries of mankind is where did we come from? Scientists and philosophers alike have pondered this elusive question and put forth many explanations. But in truth, no one really knows. Good evening. I'm Charlton Heston. In their search for answers, scientists gather evidence and develop theories based on what they observe. But sometimes evidence turns up that completely contradicts this. Footprints resembling modern man's were discovered in Texas, side by side with dinosaur tracks. Does this mean that man lived millions of years ago, at the time of the dinosaur? These 70-ton blocks were somehow transported to the Peruvian mountain temple of Ollantaytambo. The only source of this red granite is 5 miles away on the peak of another mountain. Ancient maps have been discovered which correctly depict the continent of Antarctica centuries before it was discovered by Europeans. Some claim this is evidence of a technologically advanced culture that existed before recorded history began. Tonight we'll examine these and other controversial findings to see if what we're being taught about the origins of man is supported by the evidence. We'll meet a new breed of scientific investigators who claim that the history of man on this planet may be radically different than what is accepted today. Before the 19th century, Western man looked to the Bible for an explanation of his origins. In the story of Genesis, God created man from the dust of the earth 6,000 years ago. But when man dug into the earth for answers, he found evidence that appeared to tell a different story. Evolution. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species. This book put forth the revolutionary idea that all life on Earth could be explained by the workings of nature. Instead of a supreme being creating the diversity of life, the theory of evolution proposes that accidental changes in nature are the cause. These changes are governed by the process of natural selection, survival of the fittest. Over the past 2 centuries, archaeologists have collected bones and artifacts that suggest there's a logical sequence of evolutionary steps from ape to man. Man's earliest relatives were ape-like beings who appeared around 25 million years ago. The first of those to walk upright emerged 20 million years later. Over the remaining 5 million years, he continued to evolve, passing through various stages of development until modern man, like ourselves, emerged over 100,000 years ago. Archaeologists determine the age of artifacts by the level of strata or layer of earth they're found in. Recent artifacts associated with modern man are generally found close to the surface, while older, more primitive artifacts are in deeper layers of the ground. But sometimes artifacts are found that break all the rules. Archaeologists call them anomalous artifacts. What happens when we find a modern human skull in rock strata far beneath even the oldest of man's ancestors? In their controversial book, Forbidden Archaeology, Michael Cremo and Dr. Richard Thompson have documented hundreds of these anomalous artifacts which have yet to be explained.
The basic body of evidence that we've uncovered in this book suggests that human beings of modern anatomical type have been existing for many, many millions of years into the past.
In 1880, California state geologist J.D. Whitney was intrigued by an unexpected discovery made 300 feet under Table Mountain. While digging for gold, miners unearthed a variety of stone tools such as mortar and pestles and ladles. Incredibly, the rock strata the tools were reportedly found in was dated as early as 55 million years old. Whitney made a thorough report in these finds and came to an unsettling conclusion. Man could be millions of years older than the current evolutionary model suggests. This bizarre evidence seems to have been well documented, yet the general public and many within the scientific community are unaware of these controversial finds. The question is, why haven't we heard of these discoveries before?
Oh, I think we're talking about a massive cover-up. As I said, over the past 150 years, these archaeologists and anthropologists have covered up as much evidence as they've dug up, literally.
Basically what you find is something we call a knowledge filter. This is a fundamental feature of science. It's also a fundamental feature of human nature. People tend to filter out things that don't fit, that don't make sense in terms of their paradigm or their way of thinking. So in science you find that evidence that doesn't fit the accepted paradigm tends to be eliminated. It's not taught, it's not discussed, and people who are educated in scientific teachings generally don't even learn about it.
Conventional theory states that modern man originated in southern Africa around 100,000 years ago. From there, he migrated north into Europe and southern Asia, continued through Asia, and crossed the Bering Strait into the New World around 30,000 years ago. He then came down through North America and finally arrived in South America around 15,000 years ago. Yet numerous artifacts have been found across North and South America that are so old they threaten to completely overturn this theory. According to geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre, she was silenced at the height of her career because of her determination to report the facts. In the summer of 1966, a collection of stone tools, including this leaf-shaped spear point, was uncovered at Hueyatlico, Mexico. To find out exactly how old the spear points were, a team of experts from the United States Geological Survey was called in to date them.
When we first began to work on the Hueyatlico site, we thought we had an old site. This was back in '66, and we thought it was perhaps 20,000 years old, and at that time that was considered a very old age for the site. We did what they call radiometric dates, which gives an actual date range, and we used two different methods to do that. One was using uranium atoms, another one was using little zircon crystals. When we finally got the dates and all the different methods we used to date it, it came out to be 250,000 years old. To tell you the truth, I would have been happy with a 20,000-year-old date. It would have made my career. It was very old for the time, but it wasn't so old that it was that controversial. People can take 20,000-year steps. They can't take steps that are over 200,000 years at one time. And I was rather naive. I thought, okay, we've got something big here, but I'm just going to stick with the date. We've got the information, we got the facts, let's get the facts out and go on from there. And I didn't realize it was going to ruin my whole career.
According to Dr. McIntyre, because she stuck to the facts, all of her professional opportunities were closed off. She's not worked in her chosen field since. The site was closed and permission for further investigation was denied forever.
It's not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy in the sense of some people getting together in a smoke-filled room and saying, we're going to deceive people. It's something that happens automatically within the scientific community. So when a given piece of evidence disagrees with the predominant theory, then automatically people won't talk about it, they won't report it, and that means that science fails to progress in the way that one would hope.
Ever since dinosaurs were first discovered in the 18th century, they've fascinated people of all ages. The Tyrannosaurus rex stood over 30 feet in height. He's considered the most ferocious predator ever to walk the earth. A brontosaurus grew to the length of 3 city buses. He weighed more than 90 tons. The reign of the dinosaur ended, according to one theory, when a giant meteor crashed into the earth with the force of thousands of hydrogen bombs. A cloud of dust was raised, which blocked the sun for years. This marked the end of the dinosaurs. According to conventional scientific theory, no human beings were alive then to witness these events. Or were they? Over 100 million years ago, the limestone bedrock of the Paluxy River in Texas was a muddy plain. It was here that countless dinosaurs left their footprints to be fossilized and preserved forever. But the tracks of another creature have also been preserved in these banks, possibly the tracks of man. Archaeologist Carl Bau has led the investigation of these controversial prints for over 12 years.
My reaction was one of shock. I had heard of human footprints being found in this locale on the Biloxi near Glen Rose, Texas, but I was rather skeptical. And here, after removing actual rock layers, the team and I excavated a series of dinosaur footprints. And 18.5 inches from one of those dinosaur footprints, we excavated a 16-inch human footprint. We excavated 12 footprints in a series. And when you find a trail with left, right pace and stride, the right distance apart, then you have to interpret this as belonging to humankind.
It's been claimed that the Biloxi River footprints are a hoax carved into the limestone bedrock as a tourist attraction.
Well, we found trails leading under limestone ledges and actually removed the limestone ledges one slab of rock at a time. And we found that both the dinosaur footprints and the trail of human footprints continued under the rock ledges. This evidence is real.
Today, many of the so-called human prints have fallen victim to erosion and the hands of vandals. But Carl Bau is in possession of one of the most compelling prints ever found. What you are about to see is the most controversial artifact in his collection.
I first saw the Burdick print on my initial visit to Glen Rose in 1984. My impression at that time was that it was too perfect. But it's clearly a human footprint, demonstrating the heel section, the arch, the base of the metatarsals, the first or great toe, second, third, fourth, and fifth toe.
After our examination of this print, we find that it definitely is in the Cretaceous limestone, in the same formation with the dinosaur footprints. Here we're looking at a cross-section, and we can see very obvious following contours under the great toe, and actually structures under each one. Where we see the calcite inclusion, the force was concentrated and produced these load-bearing structures, which are exactly what geologists look for. We have eliminated the idea that it's carved. It definitely is original impression in the sediment.
This is said to be the fossilized finger of a human being. It too was reportedly found in the same strata as the dinosaur tracks, dating to over 100 million years old.
It had what appeared to be a nail, what appeared to be a cuticle, a taper, a humanoid shape. After I saw the CAT scan, there was no longer any room in my mind for doubt. This scan shows the shape of the finger, it shows tissue beneath the skin of the finger, it shows the bone, it shows the joints, it shows a ligament. That tells me this is a human finger.
The limestone layer that preserved these artifacts is reportedly dated at around 135 million years old. Yet, as we saw earlier, objects have been found in rock strata much older than this. In Klerksdorp, South Africa, hundreds of metallic spheres were found by miners in Precambrian strata, said to be a fantastic 2.8 billion years old. The controversy centers around the fine grooves encircling some of the spheres. Lab technicians were at a loss to explain how they could have been formed by any known natural process. According to the curator of the Klerksdorp Museum, Rolf Mars, these spheres are a complete mystery. They look man-made, yet at the time in Earth's history when they came to rest in this rock, no intelligent life existed. They're like nothing I've ever seen before. Author-researcher David Hatcher Childress has written numerous articles on the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs.
I think that one of the solutions to the paradox of dinosaurs and people together and the vast discrepancy in time, the whole timeline of millions of years versus only thousands of years, can be explained in a cataclysmically geological view of the past, where rather than geological events taking place over millions of years, they take place more quickly, and what is a million years on a geological time scale is in fact only, say, 1,000 years. And therefore it's going to bring all this dating much closer to us and make it possible so that in a scientific way, man and dinosaurs can have existed together in the past, and in fact, dinosaurs can still be alive today in small numbers in remote areas of the world. For instance, in 1977, a Japanese fishing boat off New Zealand brought up out of the water the carcass of what appeared to be a plesiosaur, an animal that should have been extinct for millions of years.
Although the authenticity of this photograph has never been disproved, skeptics have claimed it's merely the body of a decomposing shark. We've seen a broad range of evidence, some of it highly speculative, but there are enough well-documented cases to call for a closer look at the conventional explanation of man's origins, the theory of evolution. England is the birthplace of evolution's first champion, Charles Darwin. Darwin's theory of evolution proposes that simple life forms, or species, evolve into more complex species by accidental changes over long periods of time. For example, given 5 million years, an ape can evolve into a man. Since Darwin's time, his theory has become central to our understanding of how man came into existence. It's almost universally accepted today. But according to science investigator Richard Milton, Darwin's theory of how man evolved from the apes has some critical problems.
The building behind me is London's Natural History Museum. It looks rather like a cathedral or a church, and in a way that's what it is. It's a kind of temple to Darwin's theory of evolution. People come to museums like the Natural History Museum to get answers to their question, have we evolved from apes? Do humans and apes share a common ancestor? And to look at an exhibit like this, you'd think that question had been answered decisively yes. But the answer is far from decisive. In fact, this representation is an interpretation of the fossils, the interpretation of one group of scientists. There are other interpretations, but you won't find them in this museum or any other museum in the world.
In the model of the evolutionary tree, man and apes are said to share a common ancestor. However, evidence of that common ancestor is highly contested. That's why it is still called the missing link. When Darwin's theory of evolution was embraced, it was assumed that in the next century enough fossil evidence would be found to prove that man had evolved from the apes.
Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver. They've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Every so often a skeleton is found in Africa. Its discoverers describe it as being the missing link. The headlines come and go, and then later on, that skeleton, those bones are reclassified either as human or as ape. And so far, the missing link is still missing.
One of the most classic examples of this is the story of Java Man, discovered by Eugene Dubois in 1892.
Dubois discovered a very primitive-looking ape-like skull cap, and he discovered this thigh bone about 40 feet away. He said, well, obviously they must belong to the same creature. And that creature walked erect like a human being and had an ape-like skull, so that must be a missing link, the Pithecanthropus ape man. So maybe you had a big ape and a human being living together in Java about 1 million years ago. The important point to make about the Java man discovery is that it's based on a speculative leap in which two pieces of evidence are put together in a way that's not really warranted.
At the end of his life, Dubois realized that the skull cap belonged to a large ape, and the leg bone was from a man. Nevertheless, Java Man was prominently displayed at the Museum of Natural History in New York until 1984. Since then, it has been removed. Today, museums all over the world display models of yet another skeleton they call the missing link, the common ancestor of both man and ape.
Lucy, the famous Australopithecine, discovered by Donald Johanson. He says she was very human-like, but I was at a conference of anthropologists where many of them were making a case that she was hardly distinguishable from an ape or a monkey.
These bones have been restored to resemble a missing link, part human, part ape, and Lucy is now thought of as being our long-lost ancestor. But this is merely an interpretation, the interpretation of one group. Those same bones can be, and they have been taken by scientists, and identified as simply an extinct ape, nothing to do with us at all.
Newspapers are constantly reporting new discoveries that add to our understanding of man's origins, but so far, conclusive evidence of a missing link has not been found. So what happens to the evolutionary model if the missing link does not exist at all? Without it, there's little support for man's connection with the apes, and the model simply collapses.
Some people have said to me, how can you criticize a theory if you don't have something to replace it with? Well, I don't accept that. If the emperor hasn't got any clothes on, then the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. It's not my fault. It seems to me that if Darwinism is wrong, then somebody has got to point the finger.
In order to unravel the mystery of man's origins, we must follow the path of civilization. Now, civilization is said to have spread from the old world to the new world, but there is evidence that humans were building cities in the new world thousands of years before history tells us. Traditionally, the oldest city in the world is thought to be Jericho in the old world, dated to around 8000 BC. Yet in South America, the so-called New World, scientists are looking at evidence of a city that could be twice as old. Situated at an altitude of 12,500 feet, Tiahuanaco is one of the most mysterious cities in the world. Traditionally, it's thought to have been built by the predecessors of the Incas 2,000 years ago. However, around the turn of the century, Politian scholar Arthur Poznański began a 50-year study of the ruins of Tiahuanaco. Using the science of astronomy, Poznański came to an amazing conclusion. He calculated that Tiahuanaco had been constructed more than 17,000 years ago, long before any civilization was supposed to have existed. Poznański called this fabulous city the cradle of civilization. Even though the accuracy of Poznański's measurements were confirmed by engineers, his conclusions about the age of Tiahuanaco have never been accepted. Neil Steedy, a Mesoamerican archaeologist, decided to reopen this controversial investigation.
I met with Dr. Oswaldo Rivera, who is head of Bolivian archaeology. The doctor, though he disagrees with Poznański's findings, was more than willing to help in every way possible so that we could retrace Poznański's steps.
Neil visited Dr. Rivera's newest excavation site, the Acapana Pyramid. Today it's mostly in ruins, but the base is miraculously preserved and still testifies to the advanced capability of its builders.
The facing stones of this site are perfectly set with no mortar. We took a needle, and that needle we tried to insert at every point along the joint, and the needle couldn't be inserted. A perfect cut.
One of the most baffling questions for Poznański was why they built Tiahuanaco with such precision. This, he felt, was an important clue to the age of the structure.
Now, the ancients constructed the site with astronomical alignments in mind. As the sun rises each day, it moves along the horizon and arises in a different spot. To measure this movement, they built the temple itself as a giant clock to tell them how the progression of the sun was proceeding. And we can use those same astronomical alignments to date the site.
Poznański observed that on the first day of spring, the sun rose exactly in the center of the temple, through the archway. Based on the layout of the temple, he deduced that on the first days of winter and summer, the sun should rise directly over each of the huge cornerstones. But he found this was not the case. The position of the sun was, for some reason, slightly outside of the corner markers. He wondered what that reason was.
In Tiahuanaco and in the other ancient sites surrounding it, the architecture is perfectly aligned to the cardinal points. The buildings are deliberately oriented to the cardinal points. But if we measure each building precisely, we will find errors. I believe these are simple errors of construction, not at all related to the date of construction.
After observing the perfection with which this site is built, with 100-ton stones, to suggest that such things as the solstice markers are misaligned, I find incredible. No, I think the solstice markers were probably very precisely located, as everything else in the site. And in fact, this is the very argument that Poznański used to calculate the antiquity of the site.
By measuring the angle of the cornerstones and comparing that angle to today's sunrise position, Poznański was able to calculate that Tiahuanaco was built 17,000 years ago. At that time, the tilt of the Earth's axis was slightly different than it is today. So the summer and winter suns would have risen directly above the ancient cornerstones.
The only correction that I would make is that we now have better astronomical measurements due to satellites and computers. And I would suspect the date would be more like 12,000 years ago. But that still makes Tiahuanaco the oldest city known on the face of the earth.
In his Chronicles of Peru, written in the 1600s, Garcia de la Vega wrote that when the Spanish first arrived in South America, they asked the Incas who built this incredible city of Tiahuanaca. Did you build it? The Incas said, no. In fact, they laughed at the idea. They said, we had nothing to do with it. This was built thousands of years before our time. The current view says that man arrived in South America around 15,000 years ago, a wandering hunter-gatherer. Yet the evidence we've seen suggests that Tiahuanaco was designed by an advanced civilization. A chance discovery reveals just how advanced they may have been. While restoring the ancient temple of Pumapunka, Dr. Rivera and his team discovered a long-lost secret of the ancient builders. They found a strange depression between two blocks of stone. Upon clearing out the debris, they noticed the unmistakable glint of metal.
Whoever built Tiahuanaco came up with a very ingenious method for holding together the huge stones which they used to build the site. They carved a groove in the edge, and into this groove they would pour a molten alloy, which later hardened into a staple. What I find amazing here is that to move to each site where the staple was needed, they had to have something like a portable smelting plant to maintain this metal in a molten state.
Mysterious metal clamps revealed a level of technology far beyond their time.
The antiquity and the technological sophistication of Tiahuanaco should make each and every one of us fully question the origins of civilization.
Is it possible that there was an advanced civilization on this planet thousands of years before history tells us? Investigative journalist Graham Hancock considers this to be a very real possibility. He has dedicated 9 years of his life to tracking down the evidence.
This monument is one of a category of monuments from all over the world. These monuments have certain things in common. First and foremost, enormous blocks of stone, gigantic, weighing hundreds of tons. Secondly, very precise scientific astronomical alignments. And thirdly, the greatest mystery of all, we don't know who built these monuments.
Hancock points to a number of sites throughout the world which exhibit gigantic stone construction. This is called megalithic architecture. The immense fortress of Sacsayhuaman in Peru is comprised of individual granite stones, some weighing 360 tons. That's the equivalent of 2 diesel locomotives. The Osirian in Egypt is made of tremendous pillars of red Aswan granite, some of which weigh over 100 tons.
My own view is that what we're looking at here
is a common influence that touched all of these places long before recorded history began. A remote third-party civilization, unidentified by historians, that had a presence in Mexico, that had a presence in South America, that had a presence in Egypt and elsewhere, and that left behind a legacy of knowledge in all of those places.
In 1993, an independent Egyptologist, John Anthony West, shocked the world with geological evidence that the Sphinx in Egypt could be 12,000 years old. Recently, astronomer-engineer Robert Bauval, using a computer model of the Giza Plateau, made a startling discovery which seems to confirm this ancient age of the Sphinx.
In very simple terms, the first thing that one realizes when you look at the pyramids of Giza is that they're designed along astronomical principles. We're finding that the astronomy is leading us to conclude that the Sphinx was erected in 10,500 BC. And this matches exactly with the ideas that have been developed in the geological analysis of the Sphinx. So there are two hard sciences now indicating that the Sphinx could be very, very old, and going back to the 11th millennium BC.
According to Graham Hancock, if Tiahuanaco and the Sphinx were both built around 12,000 years ago, they may have had a common source. Consider these similarities between the Americas and Egypt. Both have huge pyramids, precisely aligned to the cardinal points. Temples with megalithic stones, with extremely fine joints of less than a 50th of an inch. Both Egypt and the Americas used royal headdresses of similar style. Both employed a unique style of construction using L-shaped corners. Both used the same style of metal clamps to hold huge stones in place, and both cultures used the process of mummification to preserve and honor their dead. These compelling similarities between Egypt and the Americas suggest to some that a sophisticated group of seafaring people crossed the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus. A collection of ancient maps suggests they may have had a knowledge of the world which has never been explained.
In 1929, rolled up on a dusty shelf in a library in Constantinople in Turkey, a map was found. This map had been drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral, Admiral Piri Reis. The strange thing about this map is it shows features of the Earth that nobody in 1513 should have been able to know.
Before the 18th century, sailors ran the risk of crashing their ships onto rocky coastlines because they lacked one thing, the ability to calculate longitude. For that, you need an extremely accurate clock. It wasn't until 1790 that the first accurate marine timepiece was invented, and sailors could pinpoint their position on the seas. Yet 250 years before this clock was made, Piri Reis had drawn a map which showed the coastlines of Africa and South America within a half a degree of longitude.
And as Piri Reis himself told us, that knowledge was not his knowledge. It was knowledge that he'd borrowed and copied from earlier maps. And he stated on the map that it was based on more than 20 source maps, and that some of these maps went back to the time of Alexander the Great, or even earlier, in other words, to before the time of Christ. So the mystery is, where did these source maps come from? Who charted the globe long ages ago with an accuracy that we ourselves can hardly match today?
A professor of science, Charles Hapgood, was combing through the map room of the Library of Congress when he made his startling discovery. As my eyes fell upon the southern hemisphere of a world map drawn by Orontius Phineas in 1532, I had the instant conviction that I had found here a truly authentic map of the real Antarctica.
The mystery of this map is it shows Antarctica as it looks under the ice long before Antarctica is even supposed to have been discovered. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is that it shows the Antarctic Peninsula not as it looks today, covered by more than a mile of ice, but as it actually looks underneath that covering of ice. Now, we ourselves have only known what the land under the Antarctic Peninsula really looks like since 1958, when seismic surveys were taken across the ice cap.
Hapgood put his theory to the test. He compared the Orontius-Phineus map with a map of Antarctica as it looks covered with ice. The maps were similar, but details of the coastline were obscured by the ice. Then, using a map created by seismographic survey, he was able to compare the actual coastlines of Antarctica with the Orontius-Phineus map. When the maps were overlaid, the similarities astounded him.
The clearest deduction of all is that whoever drew up those original source maps thousands of years ago had a level of technology as high as our own. They had explored the whole globe from north to south and from east to west. So this is testimony of an advanced and as yet unidentified civilization in remote prehistory.
If a technologically advanced culture did live on the Earth thousands of years ago, what happened to them? The Greek philosopher Plato described an advanced civilization whose legend was preserved by Egyptian priests. As the story goes, Atlantis was a great empire of engineers and scientists who were in many ways more technologically advanced than we are today. It was destroyed 12,000 years ago by floods and earthquakes, forcing its survivors to seek refuge all over the world. For centuries, scientists and explorers have searched in vain for a continent that fits Plato's description of Atlantis. So far, no sign of this vast island empire has been found. Some say it sank into the Atlantic Ocean. Others say it was destroyed by the volcanic eruption of Thera in the Mediterranean. But researcher Rand Flemath believes he's found a location that no one else has ever considered. Atlantis, he says, is buried under 2 miles of ice.
Up until now, the search for Atlantis has been restricted to 2 bodies of water, the Mediterranean Sea and the North Atlantic. But Atlantis is said to have been in the real ocean. And we now understand that the world has only one ocean, the world ocean. In the middle of that ocean is Antarctica. It's right smack in the middle. And this is where we believe that the mapping of the Earth took place. It's most famously known as Atlantis.
Today, Antarctica is a frozen wasteland, virtually uninhabitable. According to geologists, it's been buried under ice for almost 2 million years. How could any civilization have thrived there only 12,000 years ago? A surprising discovery in Siberia may hold the answer. In 1977, a Russian bulldozer operator noticed a block of muddy ice containing a curious dark mass. On closer inspection, he was amazed to see the contours of a small elephant-like creature. He had discovered a perfectly preserved woolly mammoth.
In a kind of zone of death all over the northern hemisphere, northern Siberia and northern Canada, we find the frozen carcasses of hundreds of thousands of large mammal species, mainly mammoths, but also woolly rhinos and other creatures of this kind. And when their stomach contents are examined, as they have been, they're found to have been grazing on warm weather vegetation, and yet they're now positioned extremely close to the North Pole. The only theory which really explains this mystery is the theory of crustal displacement, that the land that they were on was shoved into a much colder climate very suddenly.
Professor Charles Hapgood was fascinated by the fact that thousands of animals could be frozen completely in a brief moment of geological time, and that ancient maps of Antarctica suggest that it too was frozen over very quickly. For Hapgood, this could only be explained in one way, that entire continents could rapidly change positions on the planet.
About 12,000 years ago, there was a displacement of the Earth's crust. The entire outer shell of the Earth moved something like 2,000 miles. And when the Earth's crust shifted, all of Antarctica is encapsulated by the polar zone, and at the same time, North America is released from the Arctic Circle and becomes temperate. So we have ice melting in North America, ice forming in Antarctica.
When Professor Hapgood first proposed this theory, it was met with silence from the scientific community. with one notable exception, Dr. Albert Einstein. I find your arguments very impressive and have the impression that your hypothesis is correct. One can hardly doubt that significant shifts of the crust of the Earth have taken place repeatedly and within a short time. This controversial theory is based on a well-accepted fact. The individual continents have been slowly drifting apart for millions of years. This is possible because the outer crust of the Earth floats upon a semi-liquid layer. Hapgood's theory of crustal displacement takes this principle one step further. It states that the entire crust of the Earth can shift in one piece, like the loose skin of an orange.
Hapgood documented 3 Earth crust displacements in the last 100,000 years. We believe that they happen every 41,000 years. The last one happened 11,500 years ago, so we're not due for another Earth crust displacement for 29,500 years.
According to Hapgood's theory, this cataclysmic shift is caused by an imbalance of ice on the polar caps. Over time, ice builds up at the poles, reaching as much as 2 miles in thickness. The tremendous weight of the ice causes an imbalance on the globe. The ice shifts, dragging the outer crust and the continents in one piece to new positions. The polar caps are now in a warmer climate where they begin to melt, while temperate lands are in the polar regions where they freeze and build up ice. If Hapgood's theory is possible and land masses can suddenly shift 2,000 miles, it might explain how an entire continent and its people could have been lost to history.
I am convinced by the evidence that we are a species with amnesia. We have forgotten something of great importance from our own past. When we recover it, we'll realize for a start that our civilization isn't the apex of creation. It isn't the pinnacle towards which everything has been building throughout all of geological time. Rather, it's part of an up and down, a flow, that it's possible for a civilization to reach a very high level of advancement and be wiped out. This is something we've never really confronted, and we need to confront it.
We have met the experts and looked at the evidence that seems to contradict our conventional theories about the human race. Numerous artifacts indicate to some scientists that man could be millions of years old, throwing into question our descent from the apes. Ancient maps and megalithic architecture suggest that an advanced culture may have existed 12,000 years ago, their homeland wiped out by a cataclysm that rearranged the entire face of the planet. It's been said that man has made the climb from Stone Age to civilization more than once, and that our present time is just the latest in this cycle. But only if the evidence is allowed to speak for itself will we ever learn the truth about the mysterious origins of man.
In the mysterious origins of man, we examined archaeological evidence which directly contradicts many of our accepted theories about the history of man on Earth. Modern human artifacts have been found in all layers of geological strata, some going back hundreds of millions of years. Footprints of man were found side by side with dinosaur tracks. There is no conclusive evidence to prove that man evolved from apes. An ancient city high in the mountains of Bolivia may have been built by an advanced culture unknown to history. The theory of crustal displacement could explain the mystery of the Ice Ages and the disappearance of Atlantis. In this companion tape, our groundbreaking experts will present new material in an open dialogue, free from the constraints of network television. Plus, a radical theory which suggests that the mystery of man's origins may be linked to beings from another world. In their book, Forbidden Archaeology, Michael Cremo and Dr. Richard Thompson uncovered numerous cases which suggest that modern man could be millions of years older than history tells us.
Well, we called our book Forbidden Archaeology because we wanted to take people on a tour of the locked rooms in the museums of human history. According to most standard accounts, human beings like ourselves have only been around 100,000 years or so. But the evidence that we catalog in Forbidden Archaeology takes human history back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years.
I could briefly recount one interesting story that we uncovered. It's the story of a discovery of a bola stone. A bola stone is a stone with a groove cut in it. A leather thong is tied to that, and it's used for throwing to capture animals. So this bola stone was found embedded in the surface of a cliff in South America. The rock of that cliff dated to about 2 to 3 million years ago. So the man who made the discovery knew that there would be skepticism if he announced something like this. So he left the stone in place, just barely showing on the surface of the cliff, and he got several prominent experts in geology and archaeology to gather there. And in front of these experts, he then chipped the stone out of the cliff. The experts verified that the stone of that cliff really would be what's called Pliocene, dating to 2 to 3 million years ago. And they saw him chip it out. They saw that it was actually embedded in the rock. And they saw that it was actually a man-made object. So what do you think then was the result? Did people then accept scientifically that man must have existed 2 to 3 million years ago in South America? No, not at all. One of the authorities who was there wrote in his report that, well, it may be that somehow he hoaxed the find. He may have dug a hole in the cliff and prepared a cement that looked just like the rock, cemented the bola stone in place, and fooled us all. So in this way, the evidence then was dismissed.
In the 1970s, Mary Leakey, the wife of Louis Leakey, who was one of the greatest anthropologists of the century, found at a place called Laetoli in Kenya a set of modern human footprints in volcanic ash that was dated to be 3 million years old. Now this is quite extraordinary because, according to standard views, human beings like ourselves are only about 100,000 years old. So to find these footprints, which are no different than the footprints you would find on a beach today in ash that's 3 million years old, is quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, the mindset of the scientists who looked at these prints was such that they could not reach the obvious conclusion that the beings who made these footprints, which are exactly like ours, must have been very much like us. The only thing that they could say is that whoever was around at that time, whatever type of ape man was around at that time, must have had very human-like feet, which is something that's not borne out by the fossil evidence, because the bones, the foot bones they have of the ape men, the Australopithecines they're called, who lived at that time, do not match those prints.
It's perfectly possible you could have modern type humans also living at that time.
In 1966, Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre was commissioned to date a collection of spear points found in Huayatlaco, Mexico. The artifacts were expected to be less than 20,000 years old. But when geological tests pointed to the astonishing age of 250,000 years, Dr. McIntyre was faced with a dilemma.
The current theory is that humans have been in the New World, which is North and South America, for 10, 20,000 years, no more than that. Our evidence shows that modern man has been in the New World 250,000 years, and they just cannot accept that theory. It blows their mind. Back in 1973, when we went public with the dates, I was sitting pretty. I had a good career going in my specialty, which was volcanic ash studies. I had an international reputation, and groups such as NATO and the American Academy of Sciences were paying my way to different meetings abroad to give talks. I had a part-time job with a government agency, one that I thought would lead to better things. And later I became a professor, or an adjunct professor at one of the state universities in Colorado. And I had a broad correspondence with scientists both in North America and abroad. That's all changed now. I ran across one scientist, a European scientist, who was working in the area at the same time. He was a young geologist, as I was. And he was, I think, probably working on his degree. And he came up to me and said, "Ginger, I believe that the dates are, as you say, they are as old as you say, 250,000 years, but my professor will not let me say this." And I understood his position and realized that he would have to lie, essentially, about his information in order to keep a job. This man published the lie and was accepted and is now a professor in one of the European universities. I published the truth. It wasn't accepted. And now I'm doing flowers.
While excavating a ravine near Puebla, Mexico, the late archaeologist Juan Armenta made a parallel discovery. He found a broken spear point embedded in the jawbone of a prehistoric animal, dating to 260,000 years ago.
At the time, I was very young. Reporters were coming from all over the world to investigate my father's discovery. It was considered very important, not only for the town of Puebla, but for the whole country. But as soon as the first stories were published in Life, Time, and National Geographic magazines, the authorities claimed it was impossible that the artifacts could be so ancient. So they set out to discredit my father, and everything changed. It wasn't only that they questioned his honor. They forbid him to go to the site of the discovery and denied him the right to continue working in his field. They even went to the site with guns and tried to make the workers sign papers saying they planted the artifacts. But out of 60 men, only 3 of them signed the false confessions. It was very sad for my father, and I think it was the death of a very bright scientist.
Even in the scientific community, evidence that doesn't fit the accepted paradigm can get buried in layers of academic literature.
In doing our research, it was very interesting. What we did was we followed a trail of footnotes backwards into the literature. And we would find in a recent book maybe one footnote referring to a given body of evidence, and it would be very dismissive, just saying that this was some kind of nonsense. Then you go back and look up the references that refers to. And then you find a somewhat more elaborate statement saying that this was nonsense. Then you go back to another layer, and you find perhaps a whole book, which is the authoritative dismissal of those findings. Then you go back to an even earlier layer, and you'll find many different books, papers, and so forth, giving the positive evidence and presenting it in a very serious way.
You won't find these reports in the current textbooks because they go against the ideas of human evolution that later developed.
Some people think that you can just publish this information that's controversial in a scientific publication, and then everyone would know about it, and we'd go on from there. But that's not how it works. It's like a closed system. You can't publish unless you're part of a university or a research establishment, because the scientific magazines won't accept your stuff. But you can't be part of the research establishment if you're something so controversial that they might get a little hassle from some of their alumni, or might get some bad publicity. And so you're outside the system. You might want to get the information out, but you're not going to do it.
The main outcome that we would like to see from our publication of Forbidden Archaeology is that we would like to see an opening up of our serious scientific inquiries into the nature and origin of human beings and also other forms of life. We feel that the mainstream scientific position on these questions has been too narrowly constricted for a very long period of time. Much important evidence has been left out of the picture, and many important ideas have also been excluded. We would like to see a much deeper investigation into all of the available evidence.
Dr. Bao has uncovered human footprints and a fossilized human finger in the same strata as dinosaur tracks. But even more mysterious is the discovery of an ancient iron hammer whose chemical makeup confounds scientific laboratories.
We have a man-made artifact that was found deposited in central Texas in the very same layer with the dinosaur footprints and the dinosaur remains. It's a man-made hammer with a portion of the handle still intact. Now, this hammerhead turns out to be 96.6% iron, 0.74% sulfur, and 2.6% chlorine. Now, that's a very exotic blend. I've spoken with a number of physicists, the heads of numerous laboratories, and it's impossible to fabricate that metal today. That is chlorine compounded with iron in metallic form. Now, a portion of the handle is coalified. That means there had to be heat and pressure and some time involved in this. You can't make coal, you can't generate coal just by throwing these materials out. There has to be the compression of the entire layer. There has to be the generation of some heat in order to coalify the material, even in a rapid form. If the hammer just fell into a crevice, there is no process that could have coalified a portion of the handle. That means it was placed there at the time the rock hardened and cured. I've had various associates investigate the entire area. I've been over the area numerous times. They have found a portion of the bedding plane, the actual layer of rock itself, totally identical to the material of the concretion. Now, dinosaur footprints are found within the immediate vicinity. And then you have layers of rock above this bedding plane that are higher still, that do not have dinosaur remains in them. But the material that's consistent with the concretionary material around the implement are all in the lower bedding plane area where the dinosaur remains are. Our evidence is an accumulation of data. We have series of human footprints, isolated footprints, series of dinosaur footprints, isolated dinosaur footprints, a human finger, and a man-made artifact, all found in the same layer. This means that man and dinosaur did live at the same time.
Did man live at the time of the dinosaurs? Or is it possible that dinosaurs still exist today? In recent times, there have been many reports of living pterodactyls.
In the early 1970s, there was a pterodactyl flap, if you will, that took place around Brownsville, Texas.
I was approached by an aeronautics engineer who stated to me that he had seen a living pterodactyl. He was within 50 feet of a creature, and he described him vividly. The creature was on the ground when he first saw him, became airborne, and then flew out of the sight. And he was, again, within 50 feet of this aeronautics engineer. He described him as having a beak, a crest, leathery wings, hands on his wings, a tail, grayish-brown in color. Now, the paleontologist in the audience will realize that this is a description of a ramphorhynchid pterodactyl. And according to standard evolutionary interpretation, these creatures saw their demise 225 million years ago.
We had here multiple sightings, including school teachers and policemen, of what they described as giant flying lizards, pterodactyls, flying in the daytime even, which is unusual for pterodactyls because they tend to be apparently a nocturnal type of animal. And these pterodactyls flying along the Rio Grande.
Their favorite food is decaying human flesh. And literally some of their funerals have been interrupted by these creatures trying to steal the corpse out of the casket. Now, these are very vivid descriptions.
Some of the most interesting and credible reports come out of Namibia, a remote country in southwest Africa that's mostly desert. In Namibia, people whom I trust have reported to me that there is an area where a breeding population of pterodactyls still exists today.
There is no way that you can account for creatures such as this being alive today and have 225 million years of time involved. Creatures like Mokele Mbembe of the Congo that are matched specifically by the description of a quadrupedal dinosaur such as Brachiosaurus with a large body, long tail, long neck, and small head, having been described by the nationals in the Congo within recent years. Finding creatures like this, or the possibility of having creatures alive like this today, means that the time has to be compressed drastically. And we're not talking about those millions of years of evolutionary time.
How can we explain evidence of man and dinosaurs living at the same time? The theory of cataclysmic geology suggests that the Earth could be much younger than we think, throwing into question our whole system of dating.
It's often said that the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago. You might ask, well, is this a scientific fact? The truth is, this is not a scientific fact. This is a theory, a scientific theory, and one based on the uniformitarian dating of geological strata. The kind of geology we're taught today is a geology called uniformitarian geology. And this is the school of geology which tells us that geological change is very slow. It happens over millions of years. We can see the kind of changes. And therefore, when we have layers of strata, we then create a period of time that's vast in scope, covering millions and millions of years. Yet the same strata in the opposing theory of geology, which is called cataclysmic geology, that same strata can build up not over millions of years, but in just a few years, or even in a matter of days. Fossils then, and the geological strata that we find them, are simply assumed to have accumulated over millions and millions of years. When animals die in a natural setting, they do not become fossils. A good example of this would be in the early 1800s, Buffalo Bill and his buddies went out to the Great Plains of America and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of buffalo, cut their tongues out and left them on the Great Plains to rot and die. Oh, they're already dead. What happened to those buffalo? Did any of those buffalo ever become a fossil? No. Not one will ever be a fossil. And that is because when things die, they decay and go to dust. And when you bury a dog in your backyard, he's not going to become a fossil either. What it takes to have a fossil, whether it's a dinosaur fossil or a petrified wood or anything like this, we've got to have some cataclysmic event that has not only killed that animal, but buried it under tons of gravel or volcanic ash or dirt in some landslide. The very mechanism that causes and creates fossils is the same mechanism that causes the extinction of these animals. And that is cataclysmic changes. So as we look at fossils, we start to see that they themselves are indicative of these cataclysms of the past. And now we can also begin to look at geological dating in a different way.
On the face of it, an artifact, human artifact, found in a layer of rock which seems to be millions of years old is an inexplicable anomaly. It's not so inexplicable if the strata isn't millions of years old and if the dating method that's being used is in fact inaccurate. And I suspect that in many cases that's exactly what has happened in recent years. The chief radioactive dating method that's used to date the Earth is the uranium-lead method. Uranium, radioactive mineral, turns into lead over a long, long period of time. You measure the amount of uranium in the Earth's crust, you measure the amount of lead. That tells you, that at least conventional scientists say that tells you how old the Earth is. Now, the figure that you arrive at when you use that technique is 4,500 million years. However, what they haven't mentioned is that uranium also turns into another substance. It turns into a distinctive form of helium, radioactive helium. In fact, practically all the radioactive helium in the Earth's atmosphere has come from radioactive decay. Now, if this method was reliable, if you measured the age of the helium in the atmosphere, it would give you the same age, 4,500 billion years. In fact, it doesn't give you an age anything like that. It gives you an age just a couple of 100,000 years. Now, it seems to me that any technique for dating, which on one hand gives you an age of 4.5 billion years, but on the other hand gives you an age of just a couple of 100,000 years, that technique has to be, at least, very unreliable. The dating anomalies and the evidence which contradicts the reliability of dating is being ignored by scientists on the whole because they'd have to restructure their whole theory of the age of the Earth. It would mean really starting from scratch. For example, the rate at which coal is formed is still controversial. The conventional idea is that coal is formed very slowly over millions of years and that basically it's age that determines the formation of coal. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence in the field that coal might be produced from wood by pressure alone. For example, modern timber pilings of bridges have turned into a low rank of coal. The Ohio coal seam in the United States, the rank of the coal increases as the coal goes further and further underground, as the pressure increases. So it seems that there is some evidence that pressure alone might generate coal in a relatively short space of time. Now, if coal can be produced relatively rapidly, what about the other rocks of the Earth's crust? Perhaps they could be formed relatively rapidly as well. This is complete heresy. This is one thing that orthodox geologists would not accept. And yet there is mounting evidence that some types of rock can be formed very quickly in catastrophic conditions. The rocks behind me are thought to be 65 million years old, and they're thought to have been formed by processes that work very, very slowly over immense periods of time. But they could equally have been formed relatively rapidly by cataclysmic processes. Darwinists prefer the first interpretation because it's consistent with their interpretation of immense antiquity for life on Earth. The Earth could conceivably be younger than the 4.5 billion years that it's customarily taken to be. And if that's the case, then there has been much less time available for life to evolve on Earth, and the Darwinian mechanism, which requires billions of years to work, is looking far less probable.
The theory of evolution is so popular today that few dare to question it.
In one sense, you can understand people's reluctance to drop Darwinism because, apart from the fact that it's an attractive theory, there is also a scientific principle. It's called the principle of tenacity, that you shouldn't junk ideas just because a few anomalies have come along. The trouble is that the anomalies with Darwinism are so enormous that they're now greater than the theory itself, and so we should start questioning this principle of tenacity. We should start questioning, should we be hanging on to this theory regardless? The key problems with Darwin's theory are that, quite simply, there isn't any really solid empirical evidence. It's conjecture on conjecture, supposition on supposition. They're all very plausible, they're very rational suppositions, very rational conjectures, but they are still conjectures. And I find it ironic that for most of this century, Darwinists have acted and spoken as if they had already delivered conclusive proof to us of their theory. Well, in fact, that's the last thing they've done. there is no conclusive evidence of Darwinism. The evidence seems solid, but as soon as you start to investigate it, it just melts away. Probably the most famous example is the peppered moth. This is a light-coloured moth which lives in the northern counties of England, and between the years 1850 and 1900, when the trees were darkened by atmospheric pollution from factory chimneys, the moth changed from a light grey colour to a dark grey colour so that it could remain camouflaged on the tree trunks because the birds eat the moth. Well, this was described, this process, it's even been given a name by Darwinists, it's called industrial melanism, and it was described by the director of the Natural History Museum, Sir Gavin de Beer, as being an example of evolution and even natural selection taking place in man's lifetime. And obviously, if that were true, it would be very powerful evidence. Well, when you look at the peppered moth, you don't need to be a scientist to be able to see that what's happened is that originally you had a lot of light-coloured moths and a few dark-coloured moths, that the light-coloured moths have died off because the trees have turned dark, and that the dark-coloured moths have flourished at their expense. Now, if Darwinists want to call that natural selection, they're entitled to do so. But nobody could possibly believe that that is a mechanism that could explain how one species could turn into another species, and that is what evolution is all about, not about moths changing colour. One of the fundamental premises of Darwin's theory is that a species can, if it evolves long enough, turn into another species. Now, this central idea is contradicted by every single plant and animal breeding experiment of the last 500 years. Every animal and plant breeder knows that there is a limit to the extent to which an animal or a plant can be changed. Ultimately, the line becomes sterile, or it simply reverts to the original type from which you've selected. This has even been given a name. Ernst Mayr, professor of zoology at Harvard, called it genetic homeostasis. And that simply means that there is a barrier beyond which evolution cannot pass. And I find it extraordinary that the world's biologists continue to believe in the infinite plasticity of individuals when they know perfectly well that experiments show that it simply can't happen. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming aquatic, and eventually becoming a creature, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. So there you have the idea, bears can turn into whales just given enough time and enough natural selection. Now, in later editions of his book, Darwin removed that claim. He'd obviously thought better of it and realised it couldn't be substantiated with evidence, so he thought he'd better not press it. But the interesting thing about him removing that is that the idea that a bear can turn into a whale through natural selection is the very core idea of Darwinism. It's the top and bottom of the Darwinian theory, that one species can turn into another species. And in removing that example, I can't help feeling that Darwin must have had grave reservations about the rest of his theory. The whole Earth's surface is covered with sedimentary rocks, and in those rocks there are fossils. It ought to be possible to go to those rocks and to find a sequence of fossils, one species turning into another species, turning into another species. In fact, it ought to be possible for the kids at the local kindergarten to do this on an afternoon's nature study at the local quarry. But the world's greatest paleontologists, with the resources of the world's greatest universities at their disposal, have failed to do this, and they've been looking for more than 100 years.
The theory of man's rise to civilization is as mysterious as his origins. Ancient monuments around the world were built with such sophistication that they can hardly be duplicated today. Yet scientists continue to belittle these remarkable achievements.
I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods because I wasn't satisfied with the answers that were being given to me to a huge series of mysteries around this planet. Most mysterious of all, a series of ancient sites that have never been properly explained by historians. These sites I think of literally as the fingerprints of the gods, as marks left on our planet by a lost civilization that we have not yet properly identified. And amongst those sites, two in particular are extremely interesting. One is Giza in Egypt, where the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx stand. And on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the world, is Tiwanaku in the high Andes in Bolivia.
In Tiwanaku, archaeologists have been surprised by the discovery of small metal clamps used to hold stones in place. Amazingly, these clamps were made from molten metal, poured into small molds carved in the ancient stone. But nearby lies evidence of an even greater feat of technology.
One of the most interesting things that has been found at the site have been what appear to be large stone molds. Apparently, they were pouring molten metal into these molds. This would be the pour hole, and you'd pour your molten metal in and fill it up. If it is a mold, then it's quite different from anything else we've seen in the Americas, and it would imply a far greater technology than we believed that they had at that time. We're talking about gallons of molten metal at a time, which indicates a high technology in the ability to utilize this molten metal in a mass amount.
All that we know about the people who built these monuments is what we can deduce from the monuments themselves. And if we look at these monuments with open minds and open eyes, we find something very interesting. Firstly, that the level of technology involved in creating them was high, the lifting and maneuvering of these huge blocks of stone. And secondly, that they incorporated fantastically accurate astronomical alignments, which could only have been the result of a very accurate observational science. So this is what the monuments tell us. They tell us that the people who built them were serious and intelligent people with a scientific outlook on life.
The ability of his mind to comprehend the very things that we comprehend today is there. He is us, and we are belittling him by making him less, because we have decided that, oh, this was his limitation, and we're belittling him because he was just as fervently intelligent as we are today, and that's obvious from the technology involved.
Civilization is not this linear progression. It's a roller coaster of peaks and valleys, of ages of science and enlightenment, and a sudden dark age and collapse of civilization. The question would be, how far back in time does our roller coaster of history go?
To find out how old an ancient civilization might be, archaeologists look to the monuments they left behind. But how do archaeologists determine when an ancient monument was built?
One of the most used tools in archaeology is dating with carbon-14. Carbon-14 is very good for dating bone or charcoal, but it doesn't work at all on dating stone. So when you go to a site and you find in association with the stone which you wish to date some carbon, such as a campfire site, and you date that carbon, you will get a date. But that date does not date the stone, it dates the campfire site. Now, was that campfire made by people who built the site, or was it made by people who later came to the site? Since we cannot rely completely upon the dating of the artifacts associated with the site, then we must look at the construction of the site itself. And the ancients constructed this site with astronomical alignments in mind. And we can use those astronomical alignments to date the site today.
The first thing that one realizes when you look at the pyramids of Giza is that they're designed along astronomical principles. This is extremely obvious simply because the base of the pyramid, for example, the square base faces, each side faces one of the cardinal points, east, west, north and south, precisely. The precision is incredible. So it's clear that we're dealing with people who had astronomy in their mind, and we realize this very, very quickly when we look at the texts. Their texts are really astronomical allegories. They speak of going to the stars, they speak of the sun, they speak of the moon, they speak everything to do with the sky. So we have to follow that with the science of astronomy. And the logic is to understand what precisely are they trying to tell us with this kind of architectural precision. And the breakthrough came, the first breakthrough came, when it was discovered that there was a shaft within the Great Pyramid pointing to the belt of Orion. So now we had a very clear link between the Giza necropolis and the belt of Orion. And that link, we understood it because the constellation of Orion was identified to the god of resurrection, Osiris. So this was the first breakthrough. The second breakthrough was to realize that the configuration of the three stars in Orion's belt were exactly the same as the configuration of the three pyramids of Giza. With that in mind, we had to carry on following the lead that they were giving us. And one of the major leads is that their whole effort, everything we know about pharaonic theocracy, their cult, the religion, the decrees of the king, everything they did was focused on what they called the first time, the time when their civilization began. So the next step was to see when was the beginning of the Orion cycle. And we used precession. We found out that it was in 10,500 BC. This led us to consider the whole arrangement of the sky in 10,500 BC. And we came with this absolutely amazing correlation. We found out that it was exactly at this time that the sun would rise at the vernal equinox. When we looked in that direction, we began to realize that they were drawing our attention to the direction of the alignment of the Sphinx. We have a Sphinx looking directly due east. And that is the big mystery. What does the Sphinx represent? Immediately we realized that the vernal equinox in 10,500 BC was the beginning of the age of Leo. So whether we like it or not, the science of astronomy is leading us to conclude that the Sphinx was carved in the 11th millennium. And we have to deal with that.
Many ancient cultures are said to have been destroyed by cataclysmic events. Could these events be explained by the theory of crustal displacement?
The Egyptians themselves tell us that their creation, their beginning occurred after a great cataclysmic flood. Their land emerged from the waters. This date matches very well with the end of the Ice Age. It is very likely that we're looking at a civilization that has emerged from some great cataclysmic event, which in this case is probably a flood.
In my opinion, this whole mystery is closely tied up and interwoven with the mystery of the last Ice Age, and it really is a huge mystery. Everybody knows, we all learn it at school, that there was such a thing as an Ice Age. And it's very clearly established in the geological record that, for example, North America was covered with ice more than 2 miles thick, as far south as the Mississippi Delta, almost into the tropics. This ice was stable for more than 50,000 years. And then suddenly, and relatively recently, 15,000 years ago approximately, it all started to melt. And within just 2,000 years, that enormous mass of ice had completely melted down. Sea levels went up 400 or 500 feet around the world. No geologist has ever been able to explain why this happened, why the Ice Age ended so suddenly. But perhaps the answer lies in the theory of Earth crust displacement. Perhaps the reason that North America was covered with that mass of ice was because at that time it was situated much more closely to the North Pole than it is today. It was then shifted south into warmer latitudes by a displacement of the crust, and that would explain, naturally, why all that ice melted so rapidly, because it was in a much warmer climate.
In the early 1990s, some scientists from Australia discovered some beech trees 200 miles from the South Pole, which they dated to be 2 to 3 million years old. That is totally not understandable under our current assumptions about geology. Our current assumptions about geology would say that to move a continent like Antarctica to a place where it could produce beech trees would require 50, 60 million years. Now these are only 2 to 3 million years. So what we're facing here is the need for another geological theory that could move a continent the size of Antarctica to a temperate zone under 2 million years. And that's where we believe the theory of Earth crust displacement comes in.
If there was an Earth crust displacement destroying most of the Earth's population, what happened to the survivors?
After the Earth crust displacement, some areas are completely uninhabitable. They go into the frozen polar zones and nobody can survive there. However, there are some areas where people can survive. They tend to be in the highlands because people are afraid of staying in the lowlands where the tidal waves are devastating the shores. But in these particular areas that we can isolate using the theory of Earth crust displacement, we have oases of survival, and it's precisely in those locations that we find the earliest and most important crops. And it happens not just in one area, but all around the world. It's happening in South America, it's happening in Central America, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in Asia, and it's all happening around that time. There's nothing that's really much older, but suddenly, after what we believe to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, of living by hunting and gathering, suddenly we begin to experiment with agriculture. It seems to me that all of this is much more than coincidence. We believe that in advanced civilization was destroyed. The survivors who had knowledge of agriculture brought that knowledge to the inhabitants of the local areas that happened to be ecologically stable and suitable for agriculture. And they brought that knowledge and they introduced it, and from that we ultimately got the rebirth of civilization.
It's pretty clear to me from the evidence that a common legacy of architectural knowledge was passed down from remote prehistory and spread out in very widely scattered locations around the world. Ask yourself this: if you belonged to a high civilization that had just been almost completely obliterated by a gigantic geological cataclysm, a movement of the crust of the earth, what would you set out to do in the future? First of all, you would set out to create buildings that were extremely stable, that would survive the worst imaginable earthquake. And that's what we find in these fingerprints of a lost architectural knowledge all around the world. A fixation, a desire to create buildings that would last forever, no matter what happened to them. And another thing that we find is a focus on trying to predict when the cataclysm will recur. What has come down to us from the ancient past seems to be a message that by a close study of astronomical phenomena, it is possible to predict when the Earth will again be visited by this all-destroying cataclysm.
If evolution fails to explain man's origins, then what is the answer to how we came to be? For many, the answer is found with a supreme being. For others, the answer may be found on another planet.
I did my graduate work at Stanford and got a master's degree in communications, in which I focused on science, medicine, and the environment in school. All my work in doing documentary films was in the Stanford Medical Center and the Stanford Linear Accelerator. So when I graduated and I went on into television and production and news, all of my beats were science, medicine, and the environment. And it was in that context, in the fall of 1979, when there were reports in Canada and the United States and other parts of the world, including Australia, that animals, usually cattle, but ranging through every domestic animal, were being found with strange bloodless excisions that always seemed to have kind of the same pattern from animal to animal. And I naively at the time thought, I will get to the bottom of this animal mutilation mystery. I was working on a documentary for Home Box Office, and a meeting had been set up and arranged by a lawyer in the East Coast with an Air Force Office, a special investigations agent named Richard C. Doty at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Kirtland is one of the United States' major weapons technology development military bases. It is surrounded by very high-tech laboratory and high technology development, very critical area in our country. When we went up the steps and into the doors, there were several sets of doors. We went through an outer door, then we went through another set of doors. You had to check in at a desk. Then you went into a set of doors where he had to hit punch locks. And as we came into the office to sit down, one of the first things he said to me was, "That documentary you did referring to a strange harvest, upset some people in Washington. They don't want animal mutilations and UFOs connected together in the public's mind. And I remember being surprised that he was reinforcing the veracity of this film that I had done. And then another surprising moment came when he reached into a drawer and he took out an envelope. It had no markings on it. And as he reached in to pull out about a dozen pages of white paper, he said, "My superiors have asked me to show this to you. You can read this. You cannot take notes, and I want you to move from the chair you're sitting in to that chair." And he motioned to a big chair sitting almost in the middle of the room. And as I looked at the top of what he was handing to me, it was all cap-centered on a page, with no date, however, and no official stamp, but it did say, "Briefing paper for the President of the United States of America on identified aerial vehicles." And wondering, why is this happening? Why is he handing me this? Why am I being made to sit in a chair in the middle of the room? And learning much later was so that they could videotape and audiotape my reactions to what I was reading. I began to turn the pages, and it began with a dry summary of multiple crashes of discs and the retrieval of bodies that were described as both dead and alive. And in the description on the live being, it went into several paragraphs about how an American military man had made a decision to stay with this live, it was called an extraterrestrial in the paper. It was also identified as an extraterrestrial biological entity, which the acronym was EBE, or EBA, as this man referred to it. The Air Force man staying with this extraterrestrial from 1949, according to this paper I was shown, until June 18, 1952, when the being died of unknown causes, we, the United States government, according to this paper, learned a great deal about its civilization and that relationship of that civilization to our planet. And one paragraph that stunned me when I read it, and I can almost remember it verbatim, these extraterrestrials manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien. And this was further reinforced on the last page in a series of project names having to do with our government's research, following up whatever had been communicated from what they are calling extraterrestrials. It said, "All questions and mysteries about the evolution of Homo sapien on this planet have been answered and this project is closed." And I remember reading that sentence 3 or 4 or 5 times after having read the other sentence about the manipulation of DNA in already evolving primates. Does that mean that they would take a woman, go in, get with some sort of an instrument, take out an egg, as has been described by abductees, put it in some kind of a machine, mix it up with some kind of extraterrestrial DNA? Does it mean the old Bible, the Old Testament description of the time when the gods found the daughters of men fair and appeared to come and to commingle at night? Is that the way it was done? I don't know. A lot of people say, do you really believe that there are extraterrestrials? Well, the word believe should not be an operational word in any of this discussion, because I feel that you have to give deference to eyewitness testimony. And there have been eyewitnesses around the world for at least 40 to 50 years in multiple countries who have been describing almost the same type of creature. All of these people in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central America, South America, Australia, the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa, and now almost every country in Europe, they cannot, all of them, be making up a story for 40-some years around the world of seeing the same type of what is described as a non-human creature, whether it's associated with animals or whether it's associated with beams of light and the abduction syndrome, something is interacting with our planet, and the government has told me anyway that we do have knowledge of extraterrestrials. If any of this government documentation is real, that some sort of an extraterrestrial non-human intelligence so sophisticated that it could take evolving primates and manipulate DNA and create us is absolutely true. If that is true, probably a good part of the population on the planet would resist it and deny it because it goes against the grain of what we have been taught. And in realizing that, and having to speak in the public and produce books and documentaries, respecting the fact that we in the human family have been so ingrained that we are a natural evolutionary life on this planet, how do any of us deal with the possibility that we are something other and that another life form could have provoked our creation? If the math on the pages suddenly becomes a reality, human life on this earth will change for all time. The planet will never, ever again be as we have known the planet to be. That's why it's a huge revolution. Once we finally, as a globe, say to everyone with CNN and all networks, we're not alone, ladies and gentlemen. Here's extraterrestrial A, B, C, D, E. There are planetary systems throughout this universe. There are galaxies filled with life. Then an entire new ocean, it's the biggest frontier, opens up in front of us. And rather than be afraid of it, I think we ought to go forward with courage.